These are the eastern docks. We've seen the Prince of Wales dock. You can see the scale of the reclamation here. This was all marsh originally, marsh and merging into the sea. And in 1879 that big dock was built, but even that wasn't enough, because Swansea was being inundated with ships coming in and out, with this huge manufacturing industry, which of course is now virtually gone. So they agreed to build, the Docks and Harbour people agreed to build a second dock. We can't go into it because it's a working dock. You can get permission, but quite honestly, it takes so many bits of paper that I'm just not prepared to waste the time doing it. You can see there's a big ship in at the moment. There are other ships beyond it. That's still a working dock in the traditional sense of the word. And that's the King's Dock. It was opened in 1902 by Edward VII. By then, he had originally opened the Prince of Wales dock when he was Prince of Wales. Now he opened the King's Dock as king. And by this time, Swansea is really booming. This canal, as water here, which you're standing over, was the original access into the Prince of Wales dock. So ships came in through here, but it's been blocked off. Access to the Prince of Wales dock now is via the King's Dock, and the access to the King's Dock is about 300 yards, 200 yards beyond those cranes to the left. So that access has changed over the years, and the Prince of Wales dock, which was so important to Swansea, is now accessed only through the King's Dock. But that wasn't the end of the story, because it became obvious that even these two docks couldn't absorb all the trade of Swansea, and particularly not a new trade which started up suddenly and dramatically, and people often don't appreciate this, in the years just before the First World War, and that was the oil trade. People didn't use oil much, except mineral oil, in the 19th century, but once it was realised its potential, the invention of the internal combustion engine, particularly by Mercedes at the end of the 19th century, it simply grew out of nowhere. It's worth remembering that the German army in 1914 had 85 lorries, and something like 250,000 horses. And the transformation was enormous of transport as a result of the discovery of the internal combustion engine and the exploitation of oil in the United States particularly. That's where most British oil came from until the end of the Second World War. We actually owned the oil fields or controlled them in the Middle East, but we didn't import much from them. We tended to import refined petrol, refined fuel of all kinds from the United States because it was cheaper to carry it. But gradually it became obvious that we needed to import raw fuel oil as well. And the result was, beyond the King's Dock, the enclosure of an enormous area which is broadly called the Queen's Dock. The Queen's Dock is separated from the sea, because it was part of the sea originally, only by a very narrow mole, really. And that's the function of the Queen's Dock was specifically, almost from the start, to import oil. And of course, as a consequence of its accessibility for the ships of the day, the decision was taken by British Petroleum to build at Llandasi, that gigantic refinery which used to stand there, which was directly connected to this. So Swansea became one of the major import points for oil. And by the 1920s, it was booming, and it continued as a major import into the 1970s. That was one of Swansea's biggest businesses. Now that Llandasi is closed and oil and other fuels come into Britain by other routes, it's just faded away. But in the 50s and 60s, oil was the big commodity coming in through the port. It was gradually replacing the others. Copper began to die in the 1870s and 80s, and by 1920, by the end of the First World War, there were virtually no copper works left in Swansea. The last was closed in 1924. In fact, by the Vivians, the big copper barons, they closed the last of it in 1924. Tinplate continued to be important, but the trouble with tinplate is that the industry didn't require vast amounts of capital. And that meant anybody could set up a tinplate factory quite relatively cheaply. You could set up a quite reasonable size tinplate factory in 1914 for about £5,000, and that was very modest. The result was that tinplate tended to belong to small companies who could not afford to invest. And they used a traditional artisan process, I think it's called packing, to produce tinplate. That was completely outdated, even in the 1930s, and by the end of the Second World War, completely and utterly outdated. But these companies were too small, and they tended to close down under the pressure of competition. So there wasn't much left of the tinplate industry by the end of by the beginning of the peace, really, the 1940s, and it closed down pretty quickly after that, leaving only two big works, one at Llanelli, one in Swansea. But the sheer volume of tinplate was reduced, and there were other ways of sending it out. You didn't have to go to the sea. So that the docks, by the 1930s, were beginning to suffer from the effects of the Depression and from the overall effects of the reduction in Swansea's basic industries. Very heavy reduction in Swansea's basic industries. And that badly affected their prosperity. They were all right because of oil. They were all right. It helped enormously that they were now importing vast quantities of grain, which Weaver's Mill dealt with. That kept the prosperity of the docks. It made them viable. But increasingly, the western docks, the North Dock where we were standing, closed 1928. The South Dock, which we'll end up in, began to run down very badly because it couldn't take big ships. So the dock's concentration is over here, and it wasn't doing so well. So Swansea's docks began to run down, and by the 50s, it was fuel oil really that was vital, and thereafter they began to run down badly. So that by the 60s and by the 70s, the docks were really, they weren't doing very well at all. And because Swansea's basic industries ran down. And Swansea smelted copper, but it never worked copper. So Swansea smelted all this copper in the 1860s. 60% of the world's production of copper made here, 80% of British copper production made here, passing through this port. Where did it go to? Well, it went to Birmingham to be worked. Nobody here set up copper working industries to produce utensils and all the rest of it. Coming into Swansea, along with copper, came zinc. In fact, the last big metallurgical factory in the enterprise zone, as it now is, was the zinc of Yorkshire Imperial Metal. And all kinds of other metals were being smelted because of the skills of Swansea people. But nobody set up plants really to produce and work those goods. So that once Swansea was undercut in the basic production of metal, its industrial base began to slip away very, very quickly. And nowadays, of course, there's virtually nothing. So Swansea failed to keep up with the times. The Docks Company, in many ways, were very energetic and very able. They were taken over by Great Western Railway in 1922, the whole docks complex. And they went out looking for business, and fuel oil was an important one. But it wasn't enough on its own to sustain this docks complex. And gradually, the Swansea economy changed, it ran down, and by the 70s there was massive industrial dereliction. Much of the docks was unused, much of this area even. the old docks were either filled in, the North Dock, or virtually unused. And there was just massive dereliction, which I can remember very well. I came here in the mid-60s. The Swansea Valley, where all the industry had been concentrated, was, and people often forget this, the biggest area of industrial dereliction in Europe. The 4 miles from the mouth of the Towie up to Morriston, virtually not a blade of grass grew because of the copper. Copper is a lethal metal to smelt, and it destroyed the environment of the valley. And when the copper works went, when the other works went, as they were undercut by other countries whose production costs were lower, the Swansea Valley was desolate. So that you have, by 1970, this huge desolate area stretching right down the valley and, as it were, spreading out over the old docks area. And what you're seeing now in the SA1 development, those properties we walked through, and in the marina, which we'll talk about in a bit, as we walk around there, is the attempt to reuse the land and to do something about the rundown of the basic industries in Swansea. Right, so we're going to walk around. I hope the bridge, which is a swing bridge, is open. If not, we have to go back to the sail bridge, but it's perfectly possible to do so. And then we're going to walk into the marina, but there are a few things seen from the bridge. So we'll walk around here, follow this path to that swing bridge that you can see across there. Good.